Katie, Ashley. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back to my place. Thank you so much for being here today. This is really awesome. I definitely want to start off with some gratitude, just really thanking you for, you really introduced me to the podcast life, you know? So you have your podcast, Stand Up Break Free.
Yes.
That I think my first time going on there was coming up maybe on 2 years ago. It's been a while, like longer than I thought, you know? But you definitely brought me on that show when I was going through some big changes in my life. Like I just left teaching. I had just started doing this writing coaching thing. And you gave me like a great gift that day by showing me the power of like a good conversation, you know, and to help you process some of that stuff. Like going on your podcast was like a great way for me to like figure out where I was in that moment. And so hopefully, I don't know, maybe if you need to figure out anything, maybe we can get it all sorted out today, you know?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful, I'm sure.
But you know, literally that, and it also just taught me this podcasting thing is like a lot of fun, and it's great just to like catch up with people. You know, the Contribute Universe podcast, we just, about this past week, we released our 25th episode.
Wow.
Right?
Oh,
So
that's amazing.
I think you're going to be maybe 26. So it's been quite like a journey, but you got me started on that journey. So I'm glad we could, kind of the tables are turned now, and I get to ask you a lot of probing questions. But just to fill people in for anyone who doesn't know you, so you were we will be talking a little bit about your book today, Living Life on Purpose. How long has this been out? 3 years?
I think
maybe?
3 years.
Yeah.
I think about that, 2016.
Yeah. Somewhere in that territory.
Yeah.
And then you do a lot of other things, and you've done a lot of things in the past. Tell us, who are you? Who is Katie Ashley today, at least?
Today we're recording this about a week before Christmas. So today I am very much in like full Christmas elf mode because I'm a 6-year-old.
Right.
And,
yes, you're a mother.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm a teacher, so I teach movement, mostly grounded in yoga, and then all of the things that come with that. And so it becomes very like an embodied practice. And I think that this actually came to me today, and it's funny that you asked that because I was practicing yoga, my own practice this morning, and I'd meant to do a really active practice. And then I just kind of laid around on tennis balls. didn't do an active practice at all. But by the end of it, all of a sudden this just huge awareness came, and I like ran out of the studio and grabbed my journal from the front lobby and like ran back into my mat and started writing down sentences that don't make sense, but in any kind of nice order.
That's how my writing starts too.
Yeah, they were just kind of like these clips, and I meant to bring it because I had a feeling you'd ask me this. And it was one of those moments where I was like, "Oh, that's what I do." I help people to tap in to that wisdom that was already in them, like in their body, like actually feel and experience that thing that they're looking for, whether it's like ease or strength or like how to actually feel into that experience that you're trying to get to, rather than to like think your way there, and then to have that, and then to bring it together, right? Because like you can't just be on your mat all day. Like you need to then take action somewhere from there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's the main thing.
I love that notion that, you know, I mean, you're like our self-definition is always like under revision, you know, and we're always writing new drafts of it. I do that like all the time too, just like in my journal. I'll write almost like a little like mission statement for myself. And it's so funny that over the years, I'm sure the language has changed, and I've had different ways of wording it and everything, but it all keeps coming back to the same core stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I've always really liked about talking with you is that even though we come from slightly different worlds, I mean, you have a very, you have movement-centered practice, and, for me is very centered in writing. It is a little more in the head sometimes, and it's this creative journey, but it all really revolves around coming back to a true self within ourselves, and then using our practice in whatever way we can to help others do that same thing, and that we're not going to be very effective at helping others if we don't have like ourself somewhat figured out first,
Yeah.
Though that's still always in progress too,
For sure.
So I guess I know you asked me somewhat of a similar question when I was on your podcast. Where did a lot of this begin for you? More of that philosophical, spiritual quest of kind of looking for some deeper answers. Where did that start for you?
Yeah, I actually always think about that around this time of year. I grew up Catholic. My family was Catholic, and when I was a teenager, I all of a sudden really just started to, I think it seemed very personal and very like important to me, and like I was probably the only person ever going through this struggle, but I think really like every 16-year-old goes through this struggle, especially if they had some sort of organized religion as like a piece of their.
I feel like what you're about to say is going to relate to me like really strongly.
Yeah. And so I think at that point I don't think I knew what I believed in. I just knew I didn't believe it that way, and didn't feel very heard or encouraged to explore it in my own way. And I think I started to feel a connection with something larger than myself, but it didn't really gel the right way, like with what I had been taught in Catholicism. And so that began a pretty long time, like maybe nearly a decade of time of just being very disconnected from anything spiritual at all, like totally not interested, absolutely agnostic, like not involved in any way. And at the same time, this bizarre like moments of time, like little bubbles of time of feeling very intuitive, or this element of just faith that things would work out, even if I didn't really know how or why. And so around that time, in my early 20s, I guess I took my first philosophy class, and I really liked that. That was interesting. And then it kind of went from there. It started to be everything kind of started to gel eventually between philosophy and psychology and then movement. And during that decade of time, previous to that, it was all, I wasn't very healthy. I was in a really bad place. And as I started to get better, and as I started to explore all these different things, both from a more spiritual realm and also a more academic realm, all the little pieces started to kind of fall in line together. That wasn't a very clear answer, but
no, I mean the path is often a very winding, long one. It's really interesting, though. I mean, the ages might be slightly different, but that I went through a very similar kind of journey. I was raised very religiously. I wasn't raised Catholic specifically, but my father came from a Catholic family, and I think he is definitely very religious, but he had sort of a conflicted relationship with the Catholic Church too, so, but I was raised Southern Baptist, of all interesting things. And I was a hardcore atheist by 15. You know, my parents split up, and so it was just this, everything that I thought I could count on as a kid suddenly just, you know, faith, family, it all kind of went. And I got into philosophy and punk rock.
Yeah.
So, because I know that's a part of your...
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the classic soundtrack of a confused youth, you know, yeah.
That's funny. And then I didn't even realize that at that time, kind of like when I was making that transition of going from really just disbelief in God or in anything, into like, oh, okay, like maybe there is something that I can explore here. I found that I was listening to various different punk rock that I did have this like spiritual messaging to it, and I didn't even realize. And I was like, "Wait, what?" Like, it was really funny.
What were some of those bands? I'm just like,
you know,
curious.
now I don't even remember who they were, but I'll look.
Okay.
But now it's interesting because with Catholicism, like it's been funny to see the various different lineages that I've chosen to study in yoga do have a lot of element of like tradition and ritual and music and like things that feel familiar in a similar way, which is really just interesting.
Right, yeah.
And now there's elements of it, especially like the Catholic like mystics and like there's and like contemplation, and there is a whole nother level that's not.
There totally is, and that's been a real joy for me lately, is finally making a little bit of peace with my Christian upbringing and being able to see those deeper layers and to see it from maybe like a more of a psychological point of view, or I've gotten to the point where I can actually like open the Bible again and sort of read it with some fresh eyes and be like, oh, there's actually some really deep things going on here. I think we always end up having an interesting relationship with, if we are raised in a faith as children, because we naturally have a child's perspective on religion, and in some ways that has to be shaken. And there's some people that don't go through that, and they sort of maintain a somewhat simplistic view on religion their entire lives. But I think that there's kind of a necessary process. The world is going to probably kick your ass a few times, maybe more than a few times. And I think, I don't know, I've seen it in myself and in a lot of others where, you know, maybe life throws some things your way and you end up having to look, you know, really elsewhere. You get into Buddhism, you get into, you know, Eastern philosophy, you get into all these maybe different things because it seems more mature to you, because you're comparing it to your childhood faith.
Yeah.
But I think there's a wonderful circling around that can happen where you can come back to Catholicism, or, well, I'm not probably never going back to the Southern Baptist Church anytime soon, but it's been able to me to come back around to Jesus and, you know, those stories of my childhood. And then for me, a week doesn't go by where someone doesn't remind me that I look like Jesus now. So
right.
It's all good. I'm just embracing it, you know?
Like, I guess I'll connect. That's funny.
But I know dancing was a great love for you early on. So yeah, how did that kind of go from dancing to yoga?
Yeah, dance for me was really the majority of my childhood and teenage years, and then my first career. And then I left the dance world because I'd been struggling with an eating disorder and was told that I couldn't dance and be healthy, which at the time could possibly have been true, but I think what I did not recognize then, and I don't know if the treatment team that I was working with recognized it then, or if, and I can see how they could possibly have recognized it, but also not prioritized it because their main priority was me physically staying alive,
Yeah.
not
Right.
necessarily like how I process
Which is
thoughts.
important. Yeah.
Right. And so, but I process emotions and thought through movement. Like I can be thinking about something all day, or kind of like percolating on something, or trying to create some sort of new awareness about something, anything. Like it doesn't even have to be that personally about me. Like it can be anything really. But I have to kind of move, and like somehow that movement makes a new level of awareness happen, or a level of understanding. And so I probably couldn't have gone. I was supposed to go back to college and I had a full performance scholarship to Winthrop University, which I hadn't been going to. I was going to go to a new school with a full dance performance scholarship, and I ended up giving it up. And that started just a few years period of time, 2 or 3 years, where I made only poor choices and wasn't dancing. It was a disaster. Like,
Right.
and so that time in my life was pretty awful, because I was trying to do anything other than have an eating disorder, but I wasn't even really succeeding in that.
Yeah.
And at that time, though, I also found yoga for the first time. And the very, very first time I was in treatment, and it was a teacher that taught in that way where it's like, do what feels right for your body, and don't push it or ease into it, and how you probably would have to teach if you were teaching in an eating disorder treatment center.
Right.
And I hated it. It was like the worst thing ever. I didn't like the teacher, I didn't like the class, I didn't like the movement, partially probably because I didn't know how to do that. Like, to listen to my body and do what it needed to do.
You think mentally, if she had been like, all right, do this and push it harder and hold longer, you almost would have psychologically responded better, but that might not have been the right thing for you?
Well, I think I would have liked it better, because that would have been really familiar. If she was like, put this foot here and put that hand here and do this, like that's what I've been doing my whole life. So I didn't do yoga again for a while, and then when I refound it, it was power yoga, like in the barrel bender birch style in Virginia, and I loved that. But it, because it was the only place that I felt clear. It's like the only place that I felt like I could hear my thoughts clearly, even though I also, at that time when I wasn't eating, the last thing I needed to be doing was hot power yoga in a heated studio.
Right.
So physically it wasn't at all what I needed, but mentally it really did help. And then I found Pilates, and I taught Pilates for a long time. And still teach Pilates a little bit, but around then, those things coming together, so like the strenuousness of the practice, the preciseness of the practice, and then the Pilates element of the really understanding movement and understanding energetics of movement, and then those things combined into me finding Jivamukti Yoga, which brought in this very intense philosophy, like scholarly yoga practice and meditation and chanting.
And your initial yoga teacher training was with Jivamukti, right?
Yeah. I bizarrely did some integrative movement therapy, which is like a yoga therapy style. It's called yoga therapy now. Training first, which is unusual, and then I did my yoga teacher training through Jivamukti.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I love what you said just about that that connection between your thoughts, maybe your creativity, and working that out through movement. I mean, that's such a huge part of my life as well. I mean, I'm so often looking for ways to, if I'm stuck creatively in some way, like going out for a walk or getting on my yoga mat. I don't have much of a dance background. I am kind of a stereotypical stiff white guy sometimes. So it's not always dance movement, but movement is so essential. I mean, I just think as you know, like the mind and the body, the spirit are all so integrated, and that's something that, particularly since this podcast is in a lot of ways centered upon creativity and writing. I know that's something that I think particularly a lot of writers struggle with, is because it can be a very stationary, still, very cerebral activity. And I just so often recommend to writers and creative people I meet, you got to move. You got to pay attention to the body. So yeah, I'm very similar in that respect. Yeah. So speaking of writing, how long has, going back maybe further than maybe working on the book, like, how did writing play a role? Even if just journaling, or was, you said like today, like sort of being in a movement practice and then just needing to go grab a journal and jot some ideas down. Has that been a part of your life for a long time?
It has, yeah. I always journaled. I don't remember actually if I journaled in high school or not, but I must have, because I don't think it would have occurred to me to pick it up when I was really, really struggling. The worst parts of my eating disorder were my freshman year in college. And I remember journaling then. And I took a class. I took a creative writing class with a professor named Jimmy Cheshire, who was amazing.
Yeah.
And he reminded me a lot of my favorite uncle, who was like, my uncle won me as my mom betted me away in a euchre game before I was born. And he won. And of all the people in my family that I am,
that's a binding
like,
contract.
it's so bizarre, because I didn't spend a ton of time with him as a child, but like he recently passed away, and it was really difficult. But in that class, Jimmy Cheshire's class, I wrote, and he would have us write these essays that I'm sure were supposed to just be essays. They weren't necessarily supposed to be like every emotional struggle I was having at that moment in time, but that's what I did. And I would go, I can remember leaving my dorm. This was in Ohio, where it's very gray and very dark for many months of the year. Even if technically the sun is out, it's just grayness. And I can remember walking to his office, and because he always would call me into his office because he'd be worried about me because my essays were insane. And I
had to do, as a teacher, I had to do that with several students. Like, they turn in some poem for a class assignment, and it's like, okay, like, we need to talk. Like, just some very dark things would come through sometimes. But, like, thank God they were getting that out through a poem, or an essay. It's just,
And really, he, at that time in my life, I was on another podcast recently, and someone asked, like, well, how did I know that I needed help? And I was like, well, my professor kept calling me into his office, and I started to realize, like, this wasn't okay, and that it wasn't, that there was something deeper that was wrong. And like, my dance teacher asked me if I was on drugs, which I wasn't, but it wasn't the same kind of level of like, you need to go figure some stuff out. And that I believe you can, that there's like, so really, writing, I see what we were talking about earlier, as far as your writing coaching needing to expand to include some other elements, but like, I think my life would be very, very different, and potentially could have been much shorter had I not had such a professor that cared.
Right.
Or someone helping me with my writing.
If you just handed it back with a bunch of red scribbles, no, that's cliche. That's, no, I mean, and that's why in my life as a writing coach, and now trying to grow into the realm of life coaching as well, I mean, your writing reveals so much of you, and to share that with another person is quite an intimate thing, particularly when it's maybe in the early stages. It's just this rough draft, and I take that as a very sacred responsibility. And more, I really like working with writers in that kind of one-on-one way, because so it can be, you know, safely personal and open, you know, because yeah, I mean, I taught writing for years in a high school setting, and it's 30 kids in a room, and it's hard to, particularly when you're young, to open up in front of 29 of your other classmates with their raging hormones, and they're worried about them judging you, and all these types of things, and trying to be a teacher to create a safe container for that to happen is a challenge. And I really love the one-on-one style. I think there's just so much growth that can happen there. So yeah. So when did the decision to write a book come about?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of where I want to dig into for a little while, is just that, again, going back to the title of your podcast of like Stand Up, Break Free, like when did you decide that you were ready to own your story, tell your story, and believe that it could be really beneficial for others? So I want to get into that for a while. Yeah.
Well, I'd always knew that I wanted to write a book, and I thought that the book would be very memoir style, like very traditionally memoir style, and I kept all of my journals, and from that time, from college on, and in a big box, and I moved so many times, and the only thing I ever really kept were my books and this box of journals, and it was really heavy, and so I thought I would do that, and along the way I had published articles. Like it wasn't just totally. I knew that I could write enough that someone would pay me to write an article, or someone would read it and not be like, this is terrible. And so I thought that would be the case, but then the book actually came kind of in one of those divine moments of like, this is what's happening now. I had met with a business coach about creating a course. And paid for these sessions, went to the sessions, felt like I got a lot out of them, was sitting there in the office, wrote a ton of notes on all of the tech that I needed and all the steps that I needed to take to create this course. And then I walked out of the door and I called my boyfriend, and he was like, well, how'd your session go? And I was like, good, it's time to write a book. like as I was saying it, I was like, wait, what? Like, no, that's not the plan. But then I did. So and I didn't do it by myself. I had a writing coach, my friend our mutual friend Allison.
Yeah, Allison Scher, she's been a podcast on this show, so she's a very, very good friend. Yeah.
And that was really important to me, because it I had ended up years before that, actually, maybe 3 or 4 years before that, throwing away all of my journals. I got rid of all of it.
Oh. I was actually, as you were telling that story, I was almost thinking maybe that box got lost at some point, but you kind of decided just to throw them away? That's
I threw them all away. And because it was important to me, one of the things that I think is very important as a teacher is, and there's different perspectives on this for sure, and I've thought about it a bunch. And where I tend to fall is that I'm not teaching anything that is brand new awareness to me. Like that there's been some sort of, like I've used it in some way already, or it's like percolated a little bit. Whether it's a movement thing or whether it's philosophy. And so I also think that it's, so where that was going is those journals and those things that I'd written, I wrote them very much in the midst of struggling. Yeah. There wasn't any like groundedness to it. It was all just suffering. Yeah. And I didn't want to write a story of suffering. I wanted to write like where I'd been, but also what I'd found helpful.
Yes, yes, yeah. And that's actually very specifically something I wanted to chat with you about, because I know I think you have a lot of insight on this. You know, I talk to a lot of writers and creatives that, you know, do have a story to tell that oftentimes does involve like a lot of suffering, and there's a lot of courage around just doing that. Like even if your book was very different, even if it was just a book of like, here's my suffering, that takes an enormous amount of courage, and that can be helpful. I mean, there is, you know, in the world of art, there is something to catharsis. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of punk rock songs that are just, here's my suffering.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And sometimes there's not like a light at the end of the tunnel presented in that song or that you know, whatever. And but then there's a, you know, so that takes courage, and then there's like another deeper level of courage where to say, here's my suffering, and then here's some answers I found. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not the answer, maybe it's not your answer, but here's some answers. Mm-hmm. Here's a path I found. Here's some healing I found. I feel like that takes like an extra bit of courage. And I've seen that in my own life for sure. I mean, I look back on my 20s as a writer and as a poet. I think a lot of my writing, you know, in the past decade was very outward looking. I wrote a lot about politics and social issues, and you know, I wanted, if people were to come to a poetry reading of mine, I think someone in the back of my head, I wanted to get them riled up. I wanted them to like wake up to see what's going on in the world and like go out and act and to fight. And I said at a workshop recently that I think during my 20s, probably the central thing I was trying to do was really kind of like fight the world in some kind of way, you know, fight back against the injustices I saw. And I think that in my 30s, I'm moving into a model that has more to do with healing the world, or starting with healing myself, healing some others, and by extension, maybe making some impact on healing the world. It's less of like a fight and a battle metaphors, and more one of healing. But I feel in myself, it's a new level of courage to present yourself as, or to share writing that comes from that healing place, you know? Because sometimes, it's easy to write out of pain sometimes. You just let it, writing these angry, long passages, you know? But to really stop and reflect and offer something that might be truly helpful to someone is tough. It's tough, you know? How do you find that teacher within yourself, like a real authentic teacher, and step into that and embody that? I just asked you like 20 questions right in a row.
Yeah.
But I want to, so let me try to zero that down a little bit. So what I'm curious is like, whether you're teaching a yoga class, you put out this book, how do you embody that wisdom that you've discovered through your life? You know, how do you do that?
I think I can best answer in two parts.
Okay.
The first part about the book, when I wrote the book, it had been over a decade since I'd been in that suffering place. Mm-hmm. So it had been a long time, and I was really bored of talking about it. like I actually hadn't talked about it for a really long time, as far as like eating disorders or drug use or like any of that kind of stuff that I was, you know, suffering with, or the reasons behind those things that was the real reason that I'd been suffering. But so there was space in that way, and then in that realm, especially the realm of eating disorders or stories that touch on eating disorders, and there's only one story in my book about, like, even though that tends to, in my past, like if I tell my story, that becomes a big part of the past, but it's not the only part. But books in that realm tend to be almost more like how-to manuals versus actually helpful. And so I knew I didn't want to write that.
Right.
I also didn't want to write just about that. I wanted
Yeah.
to write all of the other important things that I felt like, you know, were key important lessons that I'd learned thus far. And so, and I knew that I wanted to stay in that realm of sharing my story and sharing things that I had found helpful, and not to go into this like martyr place or victim place in my writing.
Yes,
And
that's important.
I
yeah.
made sure when I hired Allison, which was great because Allison knew me. Like I knew Allison when
Yeah.
I was coming out of that time, and so she had seen this evolution. We really, I always think it would be super funny for like when Allison and I met each other versions of ourselves to meet us now. It would be like a really funny thing, I think. But she knew that it was important to me. And
Yeah.
so I could say, like, where's this going? Like, is this going down this victim-y mode or not?
That's
or,
interesting.
you know, and
yeah.
she would be able to push me and say, like, you know, you have to tell more of this story. Like, you can do it in a not victim-y way, but you have to go more here or
Yeah.
less here, you know. And that
Yeah.
was very helpful on the writing side.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sure there's this kind of a push and pull between like you're telling a story. Yeah, you could veer left and head into this victim martyr territory where you just kind of get bogged down in the pain of it. Or you could veer right and kind of go into this, "Oh, I got it all figured out now. Like it's, you know, kind of go into guru mode, you know. And I think the answer is probably just stay in the middle in some kind of the middle path, you
For
know.
sure.
Imagine that, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really important for me. So like to stay there
Yeah.
and to, and the writing. I think writing in that way comes from. That's how I teach. That's how I always teach in every
Right.
class. Is that
Yeah.
and that this makes sense for me. Like if I do this, then this happens, you know, in my
Right.
body. Or I've taught enough people movement for 2 decades that this seems to be a general pattern that you know, that works when people do this. And not that it's necessarily universally true, but some things seem to be helpful. And I think that combination of like, okay, this is what I found to be true. Here's a few ways that you could potentially look at your movement, or like the journaling questions in the end of the chapters of my book. Like, here's a few suggestions of the ways that you could do this in your life. What do you think? how do you think that it works or doesn't work, or like what comes up?
Yeah.
And that tends to be helpful. You know, I would say, like just yesterday or Saturday, I was at the studio and I teach a level 1 class, and I'd put people in downward facing dog, which is like a triangular shape in the body. And I was like, well, how can we make this feel more like an equilateral triangle and less all about your legs or all about your hands?
Right.
And rather than just saying that, I was like, okay, let's put blocks under your hands. Like, now you're definitely going to be more in your legs, probably. Like, I am, for sure.
Right.
Some people might not feel much of a difference. Or if you were already in your legs, you'd feel like, wow, I really was already here. And then let's do it the other way. Like, let's stand on the blocks and have our feet on the ground. And what does that feel like? And without me saying, like, this is correct, this is not correct. You know, like, let's just feel the 2 different extremes of those 2 things, and then how, like, what needs to happen in our body to find that middle place. And I can't decide that for anyone.
Right.
But if I give them these different tools to experience it in a different way, then they can experience it for themselves.
Right.
So Saturday, a girl came in and was like, oh my gosh, like, that, you know, changed my life. Like, my whole practice is different now. And that's, you know, I get it. Like, I get so many things from pulling on, you know, that thread.
Right.
You know, which is nice to hear, and I'm excited for.
Yeah. Well, I think in general, I think that's one of the highest forms of teaching is to, you know, create opportunities where people can learn from themselves. You know, like you set the parameters and you create a situation, and maybe you ask interesting questions or you create a certain experience, but you allow them to experience it. You're not telling them, here's what you ought to be experiencing in this moment. And I try to apply the same principle too when I'm helping people with their writing and maybe editing, because I all the time people are giving me their writing and then telling me, well, what do you think? Like, is it good? And and sometimes people want me just to kind of say definitively, like, yes, it's great, or oh my God, it's terrible. But for me, I think there's something deeper going on where, like, I want to help people cultivate, like, their own sense of, is this thing I wrote like the truest version of what I could have written? Like, I think that's seems to be what Allison was helping you do. Like, you kind of, like, if you're working on a chapter that covers this story, I think the ultimate answer is within you, whether or not you've really captured the truth of that story. Allison can kind of guide, but if she just kind of came down and said, okay, it's here, this is your story, write it this way, I think that's not quite right. And I think the writer has the answer in themselves on how to bring an idea or a story or whatever to its fullest fruition. And I think, like, a good teacher, a good coach, a good guide helps them figure that out on their own in some kind of way. And I think yoga teachers are the same, like, it's an interesting balance, Well, I'm curious too also, like, let's say when you're teaching yoga and you're having you're just having like a rough day, you're like, you don't feel at your best, but people are sort of expecting you to be the enlightened guru at the front of the room. How do you bring some authenticity to that and some transparency to that? Because I think that's a big part of what being a creative is too, is trying to show the real the real self. How do you navigate that when people maybe have these expectations?
I think part of it is, I remember in teacher training, and I was really lucky. I was able to do Jivamukti teacher training with David Life and Sharon Gannon.
Right, yeah.
And it was the last year that they were both there for the whole time. And also my teachers from here, Jeffrey Cohen and Andrea Boyd.
Yeah.
And a ton of other, like, it was an amazing year, because like Jules Fabre and like some really phenomenal teachers were there that year. But I remember talking to David about the ego, and you don't end up with an eating disorder because you have an awesome self-perception. And so at least I didn't.
Yeah.
And so that had been a thing for me. Like, it had, by the time I got to teacher training, I felt like, I really only had a few years feeling very confident about myself to begin with.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really down with letting go of my ego. And, but I also, because it was new, like, it wasn't, I didn't feel like it was inflated or it was running the show. I was like just getting to know it.
Yeah.
And so he said, to be a teacher, you have to cultivate a relationship with your ego, not destroy it. And I thought that was really interesting.
I like that.
And I think about that a ton, because it's not also a lineage. Like, I don't really feel like the teaching, even if it's my story or if I'm offering something, and I tend to do that. I tend to connect something I've experienced or observed with some teaching. Like, that's the general equation of like how I tend to teach things. But I never feel that it's about me. It's about like the students that are present, and then it's the wisdom of this lineage of not just Jivamukti, but like all the teachers I've benefited from.
And this wisdom that goes back way older than you or me or any of us. Yeah.
And then this overarching philosophy always of kind of what we were just talking about, that like, I don't want my students to need me. I don't want them to be like, oh, I'm feeling really stressed out, I need to go to Katie's class. like I want them to practice,
Mm-hmm.
like to
Right.
have some, ideally, they'll have some tools that they can start using in that moment that they notice that they're feeling really
Right.
anxious. And then, if they feel like they need a yoga class, they could go to any yoga class and like use those tools, which is really interesting because it's the opposite of how you become a successful yoga teacher monetarily or like popularity wise.
Yeah.
And as that community grows, there's more and more and more and more competition, for like lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But
Well, I remember Alan Watts had a good line where he kind of contrasted like, sort of like a priest and a doctor, like a priest in a church, they want you to be a member and keep coming back and every Sunday and make your tithe and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But a doctor, or let's say like a therapist, they want you to come for as long as it takes for you to become well. And then the point is to not really need the doctor anymore.
Yeah.
A therapist eventually wants you to stop coming.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully. Otherwise, you get a different.
Right. I mean, sometimes we can have great. I actually just started seeing a therapist recently, and it's been amazing, and I love going, and I think I will continue to love going for a while. But the day will come when I need to kind of graduate, and I think that is very interesting. Yeah. And I look at that in the same way with writing coaching clients. If I help client A write the manuscript of their novel, it's my hope that when it's time to write novel number 2, they don't need me this time. They got it, that they've got the skill set. But of course, yes, like I would like the money the second time around, but but no, that's, I mean, I think the ultimate measure of a teacher is that the student kind of doesn't need the teacher anymore eventually,
Yeah, and I have seen, in 2 different lineages that I've studied in, I've seen a whole bunch of bad stuff go down when there is that guru mentality.
Yeah.
It can be bad. And so I don't really feel like I need to recreate that in any kind of way, or and I get it. I get that it's, especially in yoga, there is an element of that from long time ago. And
that's something Alice and I got into a little bit too, because obviously in a lot of where in India and China and Tibet, and where a lot of yoga and Buddha traditions developed, I mean, that guru-student relationship is something really sacred, and there is a lot of language around like trust your guru unconditionally and do whatever they say, and they're almost like an embodiment of the divine for you. But then when a lot of those traditions came to, let's say, the West and like the States, we kind of took our psychology, which is a very complicated mess sometimes, and then we just sort of like planted that guru-student relationship on top of it without, the thousands of years worth of handling that in a healthy way. So it's not surprising that there's been a lot of shadow stuff that's come up around gurus and spiritual teachers, and listen, I mean, it's just like in the last year of the Me Too movement, I mean, think about how many creatives, well-known writers and actors that their shadows got revealed, and it's something we all need to be much more aware of.
It's interesting. My son, we just started jiu-jitsu with him, and I chose very, very deliberately the teacher that he is studying with, because I really like him and his messaging and his how he's teaching, and there is that respect element and that martial arts piece of it, but it doesn't seem to be very guru-ish. It's more like, this is this tool and these are these ideals that are good. And so it's funny because we drive almost double the amount of time than the actual class is to like get in there and come back past multiple other jiu-jitsu places. But because I think that's really important, especially he's 6, so like getting messaging now that I feel like is empowering long term versus like obedient, I guess, in that kind of like guru kind of way. Yeah. But I also see it, like I get it, like, and this used to frustrate me. I recently, within the past 6 months, closed down a lot of the businessy side of my business. Yeah, we
were talking about that a little bit before we started recording.
And now I'm doing my one-on-one work with people, and I'm managing a yoga studio. But it used to really frustrate me, the like marketing behind yoga and behind teachers getting people to come to their class or do their courses and do all these things in a very it felt like, look at this, if you just come to me, to my class and do my thing, you'll feel better. Right. Whereas I think always kind of said, why don't you look at this very hard, painful thing in your life or try moving your body in this new way that feels really uncomfortable first, but it's actually going to be good in the long run. Right. Which is just not as enticing. And so those things used to really frustrate me, and now I think that I have some space from it. It doesn't frustrate me as much anymore. Right. But yeah, I think that kind of gets layered into that piece of that conversation. Yeah.
There's a lot of writing coaches out there that are promising, like, work with me and your book's gonna be a #1 New York Times bestseller. And it's funny, when I started doing that, like, I was so intimidated by that because I was like, oh my God, like, but now I realize they're just lying. They're just like, that's...
Yeah, or if they're not, I don't think it's they're teaching writing so much as they have good PR connections.
That's,
Or if it's like #1 Amazon seller, they know the algorithms. Like, it's not about their writing so much.
Yeah, and it's all about, like, you can be #1 on Amazon in this like little tiny niche of things,
Because you set it up right.
Right,
when
exactly.
You're putting it on.
Exactly. Whereas like I can't. I'm too obsessive about like meaning and purpose and so like that's what I bring to my writing coaching work, is like I want to help writers write in a way where they feel the most fulfilled as a creative. And how many people end up buying the book, that's out of your hands. Like, your job is to tell your story in the most honest, authentic way possible. But well, Katie, we're coming up on about the hour mark, and you've already been so gracious with your time. Just a few little practical things, like I'm probably going to put this out like early next week, so it'll be out pretty soon. So let's tell people a little bit about the book. I know it's on. A lot of listeners and viewers are Charleston based, so I know the book is on sale at Still Soul Studio, and I'm sure Mission Yoga as well, and
Blue Bicycle.
All good places. Yeah. Oh, I wanted to tell you real quick too.
People can just.
Speaking of Still Soul, I know you taught some classes there for quite a while. I'm excited to kind of share with listeners. So I'm in talks with them. We're looking at early February to do a poetry and meditation night, and then maybe start doing some writing workshop stuff there. And I am so incredibly thrilled. I mean, it's literally been a dream of mine for years to start incorporating my poetry and you know, writing, teaching work in a meditation yoga space. And
Yeah.
because those are like just two of my biggest like worlds finally. Like I'm trying to bring those together for like a long time. So that feels really good. So I'm very excited to be working with Still Soul. They're awesome. And then so you are teaching and managing at Mission Yoga downtown. What kind of classes? Like if somebody hears this next week and they're like, oh, Katie's amazing. I want to go. She's got the secret to happiness. No, I was kidding.
That'll fix your life in an hour.
Enlightenment now.
Yeah.
But no, if someone wanted to come practice with you, what classes are you going to be offering like in the new year?
Yeah, in the new year, I think I'm definitely going to be continuing the two of the classes that I have right now. There's one that's shifting on the schedule. The first is Friday mornings. It's level 2 to 3 at 9:15. And then I do a level 1 Saturday mornings at 8:30. And I'm also in the new year, starting January 8th, I'm doing the Kickstart series.
I saw that,
which is awesome.
Online,
It's a 3-week series that's the foundations of asana, but we also bring in some of the philosophy and the why are we even doing this piece of yoga, breath work and meditation too.
Awesome.
And so I'm really excited about that because I like doing that. I do one-on-one work there too.
Yeah.
My partner Brian, he's a Thai massage therapist, and his office is also in Mission Yoga. And so we're both there. So I'll be doing one-on-ones. I'll be doing those 2 classes, that workshop, and then probably something else also. There's a meditation class that's probably getting shifted.
Okay.
But I'm there just about every morning, so people can come say hi.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the Kickstart thing sounds really, really cool. So if anybody has been wanting to have some yoga in their life and don't have much background with it, that would be an awesome way to experience it. I'm so glad to hear you're at Mission Yoga. I mean, I've been a huge fan of that place for years, and I mean, I know there's so many debates about what's the right way to do yoga, and there's no one answer there. But for my money, I've always felt like Mission has been doing yoga right for a while, and I know you're just adding I'm sure so much great stuff to it. So.
Yeah, but Kelly Jean would actually be a fun person to talk to on the podcast too. She's
I love her.
Really into poetry as well. But she's done a really good job of creating, like, you could actually have that discussion and it would be an actual discussion on like what is yoga and why, and she's done a good job of curating teachers that don't even necessarily all answer that question in the same way, but she's still able to have kind of her guiding vision of what Mission is, and what yoga is, which has been really cool.
Yeah.
And it's been nice to be there and to be helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We're just going to keep this tradition alive.
Yeah.
Of just every year or so, let's do a podcast. So.
That sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.